spell it right. And this is a record. This is showing you all the blocks. So you can go here and dig through all the blocks and see the history of every coin. At the moment, I don't think there's a tool that's been designed to really mine this, but I'd like to see one because there's a lot of cool information in here. So you can see that this first transaction is generation. 50 coins go to this address. Now this Bitcoin address, you can sort of think of it like an account, but one of the really neat things about Bitcoin is that you don't really need an account per se. Since there's no central entity to register an account with, you just download the client and you generate your own address. It'll look something like this. And then you can just give your neighbor that string of letters and numbers and tell them, that's my Bitcoin address. Send me a Bitcoin. So they go to their client, they paste that in, they type 1.00 Bitcoins, hit send, and now it shows up in your client. It propagates through the network, and your client will handle all the details of how the transaction works. So this block, this is a recent block, it's just from a couple minutes ago, and you can see it has 3 transactions in here, plus the generation transaction. So you can combine stuff. So this guy was sending like, 7 small coins, and he combined them into one bigger coin, and they went somewhere else. So every time a block is generated, you put it into a hash function, and you get out this hash. This is basically a unique identifier for the block. And I mentioned this, this problem of solving a difficult computation. The reason it's difficult is because, well, let me explain hash functions for anyone who's not familiar with them. It's what's called a one-way function. And it's a way of taking a bunch of inputs and spitting out a very short summary of an output. It's like taking a potato and just slicing it up, slicing it up, slicing it up, and you end up with some hash. You can't really reassemble that into a potato. But the way these algorithms work, it's very easy for anybody to verify the same function. So anybody can take all this data that's in here, run it through the same function, and get this number out. And you can see that it starts with about a dozen zeros. This is key. This is why it's such a difficult problem to solve, because the output of a hash function is mostly going to be, it's going to be a random number basically. So usually you're not going to have 12 zeros in the front. You're going to have something else. And you have to find a number that's small enough as the output of this hash function that'll have this set number of zeros in front. And this will actually change over time. So if I go back to this, you can see this red line, and it's moving in discrete steps. This is what's called the difficulty setting. And that's adjusting along the curve to try and keep the block generation at about 10 minutes. Because if you had never changed that difficulty, today you'd be generating blocks every second or so, just because way back at the beginning it had to be really easy to generate blocks, or no one would have ever done it. So that's basically the technical details behind blocks. So this blockchain, I mentioned that hash. One other thing in the block is basically a link to the previous block. So there's the whole chain going all the way back to day 1. And you can use that to look up the coins you have, or the coins that someone's trying to give you, and verify that they're authentic. So again, if Alice wants to buy a donut from Bob, she sends him some Bitcoins in a transaction. This gets sent through the entire network. The whole network hears about this Alice-Bob transaction. It's sent through a few different methods. The biggest one is an IRC channel that has a bunch of clients connect to it, and they'll all listen and talk to each other through there. So a block is generated. It contains that transaction, like the 3 that were in the block I showed you. And once it's in the block, now it's set in stone. Alice can't get her coins back. There's no kind of chargeback in this mechanism. It's just like cash. Once she gives him the money, she can't get it back. So again, you were asking about the anonymity. You don't need to set up an account. You can generate as many of these addresses as you like, and it's good practice to generate a new address every time you use the system, just as a way of defending your anonymity. Because if I generate 3 addresses, they can't really be linked to each other. unless I send coins between them or have some other sort of common, something else in common. You don't need an ID or anything to set this up. All you do is download the client and convince somebody to send you Bitcoins. I should point out that the cards that you have are not Bitcoins in and of themselves. You can redeem them for Bitcoins at bitcoin2cash.com, which is actually run by Richard. So you can thank him for these coins. They did not come from me, they came from him. So again, yeah, in this blockchain, you could look through it and try and figure out some information from there. Nobody's really done that yet, and it's going to be a really interesting attack when it does happen, because I'm sure somebody at some point will say, there's a lot of data here. We could get some really cool stuff out of there. So the long and short is, if you're careful, you can be anonymous. If you're not, you might not be anonymous. So there's a lot of smart people on the forums. Yeah, please, question.
So is there anywhere specifically you can go that'll tell you how many Bitcoins you have?
Yeah, your client will have it. When you start your software up, it'll do all the math and say, oh, I received this one Bitcoin that's worth 1, and this one is worth 2.3. So it'll just give you a number and say, you have 3.3 Bitcoins.
Okay.
You can also use an e-wallet provider, such as mybitcoin.com, and you won't even have to download anything. You can just set up an account on their servers, sort of like PayPal. You log in and they tell you, okay, you want to receive some Bitcoins, here's your receiving address. Do you want to send some Bitcoins? Paste in an address and you can send them to there. The issue with that is that you have to trust that entity. I happen to, because I met a guy who knows firsthand the person who made the system and sounded like he was honest, but that's really all I have to go on. There's nothing that would stop the guy who runs mybitcoin.com from taking everybody's Bitcoins. And that's really a central issue in this entire ecosystem, is of trust. Because since you can't charge back these Bitcoins, if somebody scams you, you're just out of luck. So there's a number of interesting technologies popping up, like webs of trust, that are attempting to deal with this issue and try and figure out how can we figure out who's who's honest and who's not. So there's a number of really smart people on the Bitcoin forums, and I thoroughly recommend registering an account there, just for the discussion alone. But we talk about economics sometimes, and I happen to be of the mindset of the Austrian School of Economics, which basically says that if you stop interfering and you just let the markets work everything out, it'll be rainbows and butterflies. You'll end up with a lot less issues than if you try and regulate everything and assign prices and all this Lockean economics, which is what the current U.S. government is attempting to do. So we get to watch a whole currency grow from the ground up, and this is really unprecedented. It's hard to see this happen. I mean, there have been several attempts at digital currencies, Beans, Flues, DigiCash, Eagle. These have all failed, and that's predominantly because they've had some central place of failure. There's possible benefits to local communities. So if you have 100 people in a town that all decide to accept Bitcoins, they can now trade those among each other. And now they're saving money because Visa isn't taking transaction fees. The government doesn't necessarily know about it unless you tell them, so there will probably be less tax revenue collected. And obviously governments and banks might not like that so much. Politically, it's got all kinds of interesting ideas too. So if the system became global, it would be basically impossible for states to be able to regulate black and gray markets. Black markets being goods and services that are illegal everywhere you go. Gray markets being goods that are sort of regulated, like firearms. You can own firearms, but you got to go through some red tape and follow some rules. But if people started using the system for those kind of transactions, it's hard for the government to do anything about that.
Sorry.
Anyways. Yeah, it can be good or evil, just like cash. I mean, drug dealers today use cash for a good reason because it's untraceable. So it's it's very likely that those kind of transactions will be used in the network, but it's certainly not the primary focus. I would much prefer to be able to send my Bitcoins to an aid relief organization that's in Africa or somewhere, because that way I've just avoided all the money that gets lost along the way. They can take that money and use it all as they see fit. And, you know, depending on the charity, it might be spent better or worse. But it's a really neat way to get rid of these intermediaries. So let's say you guys want to use some Bitcoins. I would recommend downloading the main client from bitcoin.org, and this is basically a trusted client. You can, or if you want, again, you can set up an account at mybitcoin.com. Forums, again, good for discussion. Easiest way to get Bitcoins, well, other than the cards we have, is, well, that's really the rub. Right now there's no really easy exchange where you can go and just buy Bitcoins with a credit card. Mostly because there have been a couple attempts to do that and the credit card companies shut them down. If you want to buy large amounts, you can use wire transfers from your bank on most of the exchanges. For small amounts, you can use PayPal. I happen to prefer the Bitcoin OTC channel on IRC because you can interact directly with people who are trading, and you can use their web of trust system, which is really neat just to play around with. Or you can just convince somebody to send you Bitcoins. Maybe you have a service to sell, maybe you're a software developer and you don't mind working for Bitcoins. Maybe you have some tangible goods. You can certainly accept Bitcoins. It's as simple as, again, downloading this client or setting up an account, getting an address, and pasting on your website. And then anybody can send Bitcoins to that address. Or if you happen to have a high-end computer, you can certainly try your hand at mining. It's starting to get not as profitable as it was maybe 4 months ago. That chart I was showing of the CPU power of the whole network, it's obvious that a lot of people are starting to mine Bitcoins. And depending on how the value of the Bitcoin changes in the future, you might be able to get money out of it, you might not. There have been a bunch of people who are actually buying hardware, like buying high-end graphics processors like Radeon 5970s, and using these successfully to get Bitcoins out of it. So if you already happen to have like a nice graphics card, it's worth trying. Even if you don't, you can try anyway. You're not really necessarily guaranteed to get any coins out of this because they're awarded in those 50 coin blocks. And like I was mentioning before, they're being generated only one block every, billions and billions of attempts. So unless you have some good hardware, it's kind of hard to get blocks out of it, but certainly worth checking out. So as far as this Bitcoin road trip goes, I'm having the time of my life. I've been on the road for 17 days so far, and I haven't spent any dollars at all. I've been buying all my gas and all my food with Bitcoins, and so far I actually haven't had to use my sleeping bag and tent. I've met a lot of very generous people along the way who have put me up for a night or two. They bought me some food, exchanged some gas for Bitcoins, and I've been documenting all my travels. So I have a Twitter feed, which is the real Plato.